The heavy wooden gavel slammed down in the family court of Lower Manhattan, echoing like a gunshot through the silent room. For Edward Caldwell, that sound wasn't an ending. It was a victory anthem. He glanced sideways at his now ex-wife, Laurel, who sat with her head bowed, wearing the same worn-out beige trench coat she'd had for 5 years. Edward smirked, believing he had pulled off the heist of the century. He kept the penthouse, the cars, and the stocks, leaving her with pennies. He had no idea that the woman he had just discarded wasn't broke. She was the silent majority shareholder of the very private equity firm he was desperate to join. Edward was celebrating his freedom, completely unaware he had just declared war on a billionaire. Edward Caldwell uncapped his fountain pen, a Mont Blanc he had bought specifically for this occasion, and signed the final divorce decree with a flourish that bordered on theatrical. He didn't just write his name, he carved it into the paper, cementing his liberation from a woman he had grown to view as an anchor dragging him down. "Done," Edward whispered, the word tasting like expensive champagne. Across the mahogany table, Laurel sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, resting atop the cheap, scuffed leather purse she carried everywhere. She didn't look at the judge, and she certainly didn't look at Edward. She simply stared at the signature line on her copy of the document, her expression unreadable. To the casual observer, she looked defeated, a housewife past her prime, crushed by the weight of a high-powered husband who had outgrown her. "Ms. Caldwell." "Excuse me, Ms. Adams," the judge corrected himself, glancing at the paperwork. "Do you understand the terms of this settlement? Once signed, you waive all rights to future claims regarding Mr. Caldwell's assets, including the property on Fifth Avenue and the holdings in Caldwell Logistics." Laurel raised her head. Her eyes, a striking shade of grey, were clear. There were no tears, no redness, no trembling lips. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor. I just want it over." "Smart girl," Edward muttered under his breath, loud enough for his lawyer, a shark named Gerald Fitzpatrick, to hear. Gerald stifled a chuckle, adjusting his silk tie. They had crushed her. That was the narrative playing in Edward's head. For months, he and Gerald had hidden assets, undervalued the logistics company, and painted Laurel as a financially incompetent dependent. They had offered her a lump sum of $50,000 and a leased Honda Civic to help her get back on her feet. Edward expected a fight. He expected screaming, lawyers and forensic accountants. Instead, Laurel had simply asked, "If I sign, will you leave me alone forever?" When Edward said yes, she signed. Now she picked up the cheap ballpoint pen provided by the court and wrote her name, Laurel Adams. The strokes were light, almost invisible compared to Edward's aggressive signature. "The divorce is finalized," the judge announced, closing the file. "You are both free to go." Edward stood up immediately, buttoning his suit jacket. He felt lighter, younger. He turned to Laurel, unable to resist one final twist of the knife. "I hope you have a plan, Laurel," he said, his voice dripping with faux concern. $50 grand doesn't go far in New York. Maybe your sister in Jersey has a spare couch." Laurel stood up slowly. She smoothed out the wrinkles in her coat. For the first time that day, she looked directly at him. "Don't worry about me, Edward. You have enough to worry about with the merger coming up." Edward frowned. The merger? How did she know about the merger? He had barely mentioned the potential deal with Titanium Holdings to anyone, certainly not her. He brushed it off. She must have overheard him on the phone. "I'll handle my business," Edward snapped. "You just handle whatever it is you do. Grocery shopping, I assume." He turned on his heel and strode out of the courtroom, Gerald trailing behind him. "You destroyed her, Edward." Gerald laughed as they pushed through the double doors into the hallway. "I've never seen a capitulation that fast. She didn't even ask for alimony. She knows she's useless without me," Edward said, checking his Rolex. "She's cutting her losses. Look at her. She's probably going to walk to the subway station to save the fare." Outside the courthouse, the New York air was crisp and biting. A sleek, black limousine was idling at the curb, Edward's ride. But leaning against the passenger door was a woman who looked nothing like Laurel. It was Sienna. Blonde, 25, and dressed in a red dress that cost more than the settlement Edward had just paid his ex-wife. Sienna was the reason for the divorce, though Edward would never admit that in court. She was an executive assistant at his firm, a title that fooled no one. "Is it done?" Sienna squealed, rushing over to hug him as he descended the courthouse steps. "It's done," Edward grinned, spinning her around. "I'm a free man, and I kept the apartment." "Oh, thank God," Sienna sighed, kissing his cheek. "I hated the idea of her getting my walk-in closet." Edward laughed, opening the car door for her. "It's all yours now, babe. Let's go to Le Bernardin to celebrate. I need to be in a good mood for the meeting with the titanium reps tomorrow. If I land this capital injection, Caldwell Logistics goes global." As the limousine pulled away, merging into the chaotic traffic of downtown Manhattan, Edward didn't look back. If he had, he would have seen something that might have made his blood run cold. Laurel walked out of the courthouse, alone. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching Edward's limo disappear. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't shiver. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a phone. It wasn't the cracked iPhone 8 Edward allowed her to use. It was a Vertu, a device encrusted with black diamonds, used exclusively by the ultra-elite for encrypted communication. She dialed a single number. "Ms. Adams?" A crisp British voice answered immediately. It was Arthur Penhaligon, the head of her family office in London. "Is the transaction complete?" "It is," Laurel said, her voice dropping the soft, submissive tone she had used for years. It was now cold, authoritative, and sharp as a razor. "The divorce is final. He has no claim on any assets acquired after this date." "Excellent," Arthur replied. "Shall I initiate phase 2? "Not yet," Laurel said, walking toward the curb. "Let him have his dinner. Let him think he's the King of New York for one more night. Tomorrow he has the meeting with the investors from Titanium Holdings, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. 10 a.m. sharp. He believes he is meeting with a senior partner." "Change of plans," Laurel said, raising her hand. Instantly, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, painted a deep, midnight blue, pulled up to the curb. It had been waiting around the corner, out of Edward's sight. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out, bowing slightly as he opened the rear door. "What is the change, Miss Adams?" Arthur asked over the line. Laurel slid into the plush leather interior of the car, removing her frayed trench coat to reveal a tailored Chanel suit underneath that screamed power. "He isn't meeting a partner," Laurel said, a terrifyingly calm smile touching her lips. "Tell the board that the chairman will be conducting the meeting personally." "Understood," Arthur said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "And just to confirm, the chairman is you?" "The chairman is me," Laurel confirmed. "I want to see the look on his face when he realizes he just divorced his boss." She ended the call and tossed the phone onto the seat next to her. "Where to, Mom?" the driver asked, meeting her eyes in the rear-view mirror. "The Four Seasons," Laurel said. "I have a celebration of my own to attend. And Thomas?" "Yes, Mom. Burn this trench coat." The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Tribeca penthouse, hitting Edward Caldwell directly in the eyes. He groaned, rolling over and burying his face in a pillow that smelled of Sienna's cloying vanilla perfume. It was too sweet, too cheap, and entirely too pervasive. He sat up, fighting a throbbing headache. The celebration at Le Bernardin had turned into drinks at a private club in Soho, and he had overindulged. He looked at the other side of the bed. Sienna was sprawled out, her mouth slightly open, snoring softly. For a moment, a flicker of irritation surged through him. Laurel never snored. Laurel never left her makeup wipes on the mahogany nightstand, staining the wood. Laurel was a ghost in her own house, silent, efficient, invisible. "Get up," Edward muttered, kicking the duvet off his legs. He checked his phone. 7:30 a.m. The meeting with Titanium Holdings was at 10 a.m. This was the most critical 3 hours of his career. Caldwell Logistics was bleeding cash. The shipping lanes in the Pacific were costing him a fortune in fuel, and he had leveraged the company to the hilt to buy out his previous partners. He needed Titanium's capital injection, $50 million to stay afloat. If he didn't get it, the creditors would come for everything: the penthouse, the cars, the status. He walked into the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. He looked at himself in the mirror. Deep lines were etching themselves around his eyes, but he still had that jawline, that predator's look that investors loved. "You're a winner, Edward," he whispered to his reflection. "You cut the dead weight. Now you fly." He showered and dressed with military precision. He chose his armor carefully, a navy blue bespoke suit from Anderson and Shepherd on Savile Row, a crisp white shirt, and a tie in a deep shade of crimson, a power color. He strapped on his Patek Philippe Nautilus, the weight of the platinum reassuring against his wrist. When he walked back into the bedroom, Sienna was sitting up, scrolling through Instagram. "Babe, are we going to brunch later?" she asked, not looking up. "I saw this cute place in the village." "I'm working, Sienna," Edward snapped, adjusting his cufflinks. "I'm about to close a $50 million deal. I don't have time for eggs, Benedict." She pouted, a look that used to be cute, but was rapidly becoming annoying. "You're always working." Now that she's gone, I thought we'd have time. "She's gone because she was boring and lacked ambition," Edward said coldly. "Don't make me think the same of you. Call an Uber if you're going out. I need the driver." He didn't wait for her response. He grabbed his briefcase, fine Italian leather, and walked out the door. He felt sharp. He felt dangerous. He felt ready. 5 miles uptown, in the presidential suite of the Mandarin Oriental, the atmosphere was very different. There was no clutter, no cheap perfume, and certainly no hesitation. Laurel Adams stood in the center of the living area, her arms extended, as a tailor adjusted the hem of her skirt. "Is the fit to your liking, Miss Adams?" the tailor asked nervously. "Take it in 1/4 of an inch at the waist, Marco," Laurel said, her voice calm but commanding. "I don't want to look like I'm hiding anything. I want to look like I own the building." "Of course, Ma'am." Laurel looked at herself in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger to the version of herself that had existed for the last 5 years. That Laurel, Edward's Laurel, wore beige cardigans, flat shoes, and kept her hair in a messy bun. She apologized for taking up space. She cooked dinner and cleaned up the plates while Edward took calls. This Laurel was different. She was dressed in a structure-shouldered blazer by Alexander McQueen, tailored to intimidating perfection. Her hair, usually dull and lifeless, had been treated and styled into a sleek, sharp bob that framed her face like a helmet of glossy armor. She wore no jewelry, except for a pair of vintage Cartier earrings, simple, elegant, and worth more than the house Edward grew up in. Arthur Penhaligon stood by the window, reviewing a tablet. "The board is assembled at the headquarters," Arthur reported without looking up. "They have been briefed on the situation. They understand that Mr. Caldwell is not to know your identity until you enter the room." "And the portfolio?" Laurel asked. "Updated. We acquired the controlling stake in his secondary lender this morning at 6 a.m. Essentially, Ms. Adams, you not only hold the keys to his future funding, but you now also own his debt. If you snap your fingers, Caldwell Logistics enters receivership by noon." Laurel smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who had played dead for years, waiting for the hunter to get close enough to bite. "I don't want to bankrupt him, Arthur." "Not yet," Laurel said, stepping out of the suit as the tailor finished the quick stitch. "Bankrupting him is too easy. It's just numbers. I want to break his reality. I want him to understand that the woman he treated like a servant was the one building the throne he was so desperate to sit on." She checked her reflection one last time. She applied a coat of dark red lipstick. Dior 999. "Let's go," she said. "My ex-husband hates to be kept waiting, and I intend to make him wait." The headquarters of Titanium Holdings was a monolith of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district. It was a building that screamed old money disguised as new tech. There was no sign outside, just a sleek, secure lobby that required biometric clearance to enter. Edward Caldwell walked through the revolving doors, Gerald Fitzpatrick at his side. Gerald was sweating slightly in his grey suit. "This place is intense," Gerald muttered, looking at the security guards who looked more like private military contractors than lobby attendants. "It's money, Gerald," Edward said, handing his ID to the front desk. "This is what real power smells like. Sterile air and fear. Get used to it. After today, we're going to be regulars here." The receptionist, a young woman with a face of stone, checked their credentials. "Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Fitzpatrick, you are expected on the 40th floor. Boardroom A." "Is the senior partner, Mr. Sterling, ready for us?" Edward asked, trying to sound casual. He had practiced his pitch to Mr. Sterling for weeks. The receptionist didn't blink. "The board is waiting." She handed them 2 visitor passes. Edward noticed they were red. Everyone else walking through the lobby had blue or black passes. He brushed it off. Red probably meant VIP. They took the elevator up. The ride was smooth and silent, the numbers climbing rapidly. 10, 20, 30, 40. The doors slid open to reveal a reception area that looked more like a modern art gallery than an office. The walls were adorned with original Basquiat's and Rothko's. The furniture was minimal and uncomfortable looking. "Gentlemen," an assistant said, standing up, "please follow me." She led them down a long corridor. It was strangely quiet. Usually, offices like this buzzed with phones and typing. Here, the silence was heavy. It was the silence of people who made decisions that shifted economies, not people who sold shipping containers. They reached a set of double doors made of frosted glass. The assistant opened them. Edward strode in, chest out, ready to dominate the room. The boardroom was massive. A 40-foot table made of reclaimed black oak sat in the center. At the far end, facing the door, sat 5 people, 3 men, 2 women. They were all dressed in impeccable suits, looking at laptops or tablets. They didn't stand up when Edward entered. They didn't even smile. "Gentlemen," Edward said, projecting his voice. "I'm Edward Caldwell. This is my legal counsel, Gerald Fitzpatrick. Thank you for seeing us." One of the men, a silver-haired shark named Preston, the COO of Titanium, looked up over his glasses. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell." It wasn't a request. Edward faltered for a microsecond, but recovered. He pulled out a chair and sat. Gerald sat next to him, opening his briefcase with trembling hands. "I assume Mr. Sterling is running late?" Edward asked, looking at the empty chair at the head of the table. "Mr. Sterling doesn't handle accounts of your size," Preston said dismissively. "This meeting is being presided over by the chairman." Edward frowned. "The chairman? I was told." "You were told to be here at 10 a.m. Preston cut him off. "You are here. The chairman will be here shortly. In the meantime, let's look at your financials. Page 4 of your prospectus." For the next 10 minutes, the board tore Edward apart. They didn't attack him with anger, they dissected him with math. They pointed out the fuel inefficiencies, the bad leases on the warehouses in Jersey, the declining morale of his workforce. "You're leveraged at 400%, a woman named Vivian said, tapping a stylus on her iPad. "If interest rates go up by 1/4 of a point, you're insolvent." "We have a growth strategy," Edward argued, feeling the sweat prickle on his back. "That's why we need the capital, to modernize the fleet." "You don't need capital, Mr. Caldwell," Preston said dryly. "You need a miracle." "I have the experience," Edward snapped, losing his cool. "I built this company from the ground up. My wife, my ex-wife, she was a dead weight, holding me back from taking these risks. Now that I've streamlined my personal life, I can focus entirely on—" The heavy oak doors at the back of the room clicked. The sound was soft, but it silenced the room instantly. Preston stopped talking. Vivian put down her stylus. All 5 board members stood up in unison. It was a reflex, a display of absolute deference. Edward blinked. Why are they standing? He turned in his chair to look at the door. A woman walked in. The first thing Edward noticed was the shoes. Black, red-bottomed Louboutin stilettos clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete floor. Then the legs, clad in sheer stockings. Then the suit, sharp, expensive, powerful. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm. She didn't look at Edward. She walked straight to the head of the table, the empty seat. Edward stared. The profile was familiar. The walk was... No, it couldn't be. The hair was different. Short, sharp, stylish. The clothes were worlds apart from the clearance rack items he was used to seeing. But the curve of the jaw, the grey eyes... The woman reached the head of the table. She placed the portfolio down on the wood with a deliberate thud. She placed her hands on the table and leaned forward, looking directly at the board members. "Please sit," she said. The voice. It was lower, huskier, colder, but undeniably hers. Edward felt the blood drain from his face. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Laurel," he whispered. It came out as a squeak. Laurel Adams turned her head slowly, as if she had just noticed a fly buzzing in the room. She looked at Edward. There was no love in her eyes. No fear. No submission. There was only the icy detachment of a god looking at an insect. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "In this room, you will address me as Ms. Adams, or if you prefer, Madame Chairman." Gerald Fitzpatrick dropped his pen. It clattered loudly on the floor. I don't understand," Edward stammered, standing up halfway, his legs shaking. "What are you doing here? How did you get in? Did you follow me?" Preston, the COO, cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell, are you unwell? You are speaking to the majority shareholder and chairman of the board of Titanium Holdings. If you cannot show the proper respect, security will escort you out." Edward looked from Preston to Laurel, his brain misfiring. "Chairman!" No, that's impossible. "Sit down, Edward," she commanded. "Edward. Sit down, Edward," she commanded. Edward sat. He didn't want to. but his legs gave out. "You seem confused," Laurel said, taking her seat at the head of the table. She opened the portfolio. "Let me clarify the situation. You came here begging for $50 million to save your failing logistics company. You assumed you were meeting with a group of strangers who would be dazzled by your charm and your expensive suit." She picked up a document, a copy of the divorce decree signed yesterday. "Instead," she continued, "you are meeting with the woman you spent 5 years belittling. The woman you called simple. The woman you divorced yesterday because you thought you had outgrown her." She slid the divorce decree down the long table. It slid perfectly, stopping right in front of Edward. "You were right about one thing, Edward," Laurel said softly. "You had outgrown our marriage, but you were wrong about the direction. You didn't rise above me. You were simply too small to see where I was standing." "Laurel, stop this," Edward hissed, his face flushing red. "If this is some kind of sick joke, did you win the lottery? Is that it? You're playing dress-up?" Laurel laughed, a genuine melodic laugh that chilled the room. "Arthur," Laurel said, not looking away from Edward, "please put the org chart on the screen." The massive screen behind Laurel flickered to life. It showed the corporate structure of Titanium Holdings. At the top was a shell company, Adams Family Trust. Below that, subsidiaries in real estate, tech, pharma, and private equity. The total valuation at the bottom corner of the screen read $4.2 billion. "My family has owned half of the shipping ports on the East Coast since the 1920s, Laurel explained, her tone conversational. "I stepped away from the daily operations 5 years ago because I fell in love. I wanted a simple life. I wanted to be a wife. I wanted to support a man who had potential." She leaned back in her leather chair, interlacing her fingers. "I hid my wealth because I wanted to be sure you loved me, not the checkbook. And for a while, I thought you did. But then you started to change. You got a little taste of success. Success I helped you get by introducing you to the right suppliers, though you never noticed. And you became disappointed in me. You thought I was plain, boring, poor." Edward felt like he was suffocating. He remembered the nights he had come home and lectured her on economics, on how the real world worked. He remembered handing her an allowance of $200 a week for groceries and telling her to make it stretch. She was a billionaire. She could have bought his entire company out of her petty cash fund. I didn't know," Edward whispered. "Ignorance is not a defense in my boardroom, Mr. Caldwell," Laurel said sharply. "Now, let's talk business. You need $50 million. Titanium Holdings usually requires a 20% equity stake for that kind of risk." Hope flared in Edward's chest. She was a businesswoman. Maybe she would still do the deal. Maybe he could salvage this. "Yes," Edward said, straightening his tie. 20%. That's fair. We can agree to that." Laurel shook her head. "I said usually. But given the mismanagement I've observed, and the character flaws of the CEO, the risk profile is significantly higher." She turned to Preston. "What is our offer, Preston?" Preston smirked. "In exchange for the $50 million capital injection, Titanium Holdings requires 80% equity, full voting rights, and the immediate resignation of the current CEO." "What?" Edward screamed, jumping to his feet. 80%? Resignation? You're stealing my company." "I'm saving your employees from your incompetence," Laurel corrected him coolly. "Take the deal, Edward, or walk out the door. If you walk out, I call your creditors at 11 a.m. I own your debt now, by the way. If I call it in, you lose the company anyway, plus the penthouse, and probably that watch." Edward looked at Gerald, Gerald was pale, staring at the floor. "Do something," Edward yelled at his lawyer. "There's nothing to do, Edward," Gerald whispered. "They have you cornered. If they owned the debt, they can foreclose." Edward looked back at Laurel. She was checking her manicure, looking bored. "You can't do this," Edward pleaded, his voice cracking. "Laurel, please. We were married. I loved you." Laurel's head snapped up. Her eyes flashed with sudden, terrifying anger. "Do not insult my intelligence with that word," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You loved the idea of being superior to me. You celebrated yesterday. I saw you. You celebrated discarding me like trash." She stood up. "You have 5 minutes to sign the transfer papers. If you don't, I will destroy Caldwell Logistics before lunch. Tick-tock, Edward. Resignation of Edward Caldwell. He had resigned from the company. He had been working there for over a decade. He had been a loyal employee. 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 He had been. Resignation of Edward Caldwell. He had walked in as a king. He was about to leave as a beggar. And the worst part, the woman who had just executed him was the same woman who used to iron his shirts. "Give me the pen," Edward choked out. The scratch of the pen on the paper sounded like a thunderclap in the silent boardroom. Edward Caldwell. With that signature, he transferred 80% of his life's work to the woman he had discarded less than 24 hours ago. Edward dropped the pen. He felt hollowed out, a shell of the man who had strutted into the building that morning. "Done," he rasped, staring at the ink. "Are you happy now, Laurel? You won." Laurel didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply reached out, picked up the document, and handed it to Arthur Penhaligon. "This isn't about winning, Edward," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "It's about correction. You are driving this company into the ground. I'm simply taking the wheel before you kill everyone on board." She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The board members immediately began gathering their things. "Preston," Laurel said, addressing the COO. "Issue the press release immediately. Titanium Holdings acquires majority stake in Caldwell Logistics. Edward Caldwell steps down effective immediately. Make sure the market knows that new management is in place before the closing bell." "Understood, Madam Chairman," Preston said, tapping his phone. Edward stood up, his legs unsteady. "So, what now? Do I keep my office? I assume you'll need me for the transition. I know the clients better than anyone." Laurel looked at him with genuine confusion. "Why would I keep you? You're the problem, Edward, not the solution." She turned to the head of security, a burly man standing by the door. "Mr. Caldwell is no longer an employee of this company or its subsidiaries. Please escort him to the lobby, collect his building pass and company devices." "Wait," Edward stammered. "My phone? My laptop? All my contacts are on there." "They are company property," Laurel said, checking her watch. "And since you signed the separation agreement without reading paragraph 4, you'll find you also agreed to a 5-year non-compete clause. You can't work in logistics in North America until 2031. Edward gaped at her. You gutted me." "I treated you exactly how you treated me during the divorce settlement," Laurel replied. "Strictly business. Goodbye, Edward." She turned her back on him and walked toward a side door leading to her private office. She didn't look back. 2 security guards stepped forward. "Sir, please hand over your phone and pass." Edward reluctantly handed over the company-issued iPhone and his badge. He felt naked without them. Gerald Fitzpatrick, his lawyer, was already packing up his briefcase, avoiding Edward's eyes. "Gerald, say something!" Edward hissed as the guards ushered them into the hallway. "Sue them! This was coercion!" Gerald quickened his pace, pressing the elevator button. "Edward, you signed the papers. You had counsel present, me, and you ignored my advice to negotiate earlier. There's nothing I can do." "You work for me," Edward shouted, his voice echoing in the sterile corridor. The elevator doors opened. Gerald stepped in, but he held up a hand to stop Edward from following. "Actually, Edward," Gerald said, adjusting his glasses, "my retainer was paid through the company account. Since you are no longer the CEO, and the company accounts are now frozen by the new board. I don't work for you, and considering your personal assets are tied up in debt that your ex-wife now owns, I doubt you can afford my hourly rate." The doors slid shut, leaving Edward standing in the hallway with 2 security guards. "This way, sir," one guard said, gripping Edward's elbow firmly. They didn't take him down the main elevator. They took him to the freight elevator, the slow, clanking metal box used for trash and deliveries. It smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. When the doors opened at the ground floor, they didn't lead to the polished lobby where he had entered. They led to the loading dock in the back alley. "You can't be serious," Edward spat, stepping out onto the wet pavement. "You're throwing me out with the garbage." "Policy, sir," the guard said, tossing Edward's leather briefcase onto the ground next to him. "Have a nice day." The heavy metal door slammed shut and locked with a magnetic clank. Edward stood in the alley, surrounded by dumpsters. It was starting to rain, a cold, miserable New York drizzle. He looked down at his bespoke suit, now getting speckled with water. He reached for his pocket to call his driver, then remembered he didn't have his phone. He patted his other pocket, his wallet. He still had his personal credit cards. He could call an Uber, but he couldn't use the app without a phone. He ran out of the alley to the main street, hoping to catch his limo. Maybe the driver was still waiting. He rounded the corner just in time to see the black limousine pulling away. The driver, Thomas, was at the wheel. But he wasn't alone. Sitting in the back seat, visible through the tinted window, was Laurel. She was looking straight ahead, calm and regal. Edward chased the car for a few steps. "Thomas! Stop! That's my car!" The car didn't slow down. It merged into traffic and vanished. Edward stood on the sidewalk, drenched, humiliated, and alone. Passers-by gave him wide berths, eyeing the frantic man in the expensive suit, shouting at traffic. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had lost everything in the blink of an eye. He hailed a yellow cab, aggressive and desperate. "Tribeca," he barked at the driver as he slid into the cracked vinyl seat. "And step on it." He needed to get home. He needed to regroup. He needed Sienna. She was young. She was resourceful. They could sell the penthouse, take the cash, and move to Miami. Start over. He was Edward Caldwell. He could build it again. The cab driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You got cash, buddy. Card machine is broken." "I have cards," Edward snapped. "Figure it out." He leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. The image of Laurel at the head of that table burned in his mind. How had he been so blind? She had played the long game, and she had played it perfectly. But he still had the penthouse. That was in his name. It was worth $6 million. That was his safety net. Or so he thought. The elevator to the penthouse opened directly into the living room. Usually, Edward felt a surge of pride when the door slid apart, revealing the panoramic view of the Hudson River and the ultra-modern Italian furniture. Today, he just felt panic. "Sienna!" he called out, dropping his wet briefcase on the floor. Water dripped from his hair onto the white marble tiles. "Sienna, we have a problem. Start packing. We need to liquidate." The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. He walked into the living room. It was messy. Cushions were thrown on the floor. Drawers were pulled open. "Sienna?" He ran to the master bedroom. The room looked like a hurricane had hit it. The walk-in closet, the one Sienna had been so excited to claim from Laurel, was flung open. Clothes were strewn everywhere. But not just any clothes. His clothes. His suits were pulled off the hangers and dumped on the floor. His shoe collection was scattered. But Sienna's side? Empty. Her designer dresses, the furs he had bought her, the handbags, all gone. Edward spun around, confused. Was she robbed? Did she leave? He saw a movement in the corner of the room. Sienna was there, standing by the safe. She had the door open. She was stuffing stacks of cash, his emergency fund, into a Louis Vuitton duffel bag. "Sienna, what are you doing?" Edward asked, rushing over. "Thank God you're packing. We have to go. Laurel, she took the company." Sienna didn't look scared. She didn't look comforting. She looked annoyed. She zipped up the bag and slung it over her shoulder. She was wearing her coat and boots. She looked at him with a sneer he had never seen before. "I know," Sienna said, her voice hard. "It's all over Twitter, Edward. Caldwell ousted by ex-wife Billionaire. You're trending. And not in a good way." Edward froze. "You saw the news." "Everyone saw the news," Sienna scoffed. "And then I got a call from the bank. The supplementary credit card you gave me? Declined at Saks an hour ago. Embarrassing." "It's just a temporary freeze," Edward pleaded, reaching for her arm. "Laurel owns the debt. She's squeezing me. But we can fight it. We sell the apartment. We go to Miami." Sienna laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound. She stepped back, shaking off his hand. "We?" she asked incredulously. "There is no we, Edward. I signed up for the CEO of Caldwell Logistics. I signed up for first-class flights, galas, and this penthouse. I didn't sign up for a broke, unemployed loser who got outsmarted by his mousy ex-wife." "I love you, Sienna," Edward said, the words tasting like ash. "Doesn't that matter?" Sienna rolled her eyes. "Oh, grow up. You didn't love me. You loved that I was 25 and looked good on your arm. And I loved your black card. It was a transaction. And now your credit is no good." She walked past him, heading for the door. "You can't leave me," Edward shouted, panic rising in his throat. "I have nothing." "You have your intelligence," Sienna mocked, quoting him. "Isn't that what you told Laurel? That you were the genius and she was the burden? Looks like you had it backwards, babe." She reached the elevator and pressed the button. "By the way," she added, "I pawned the engagement ring this morning while you were at your meeting. I figured the market value was going to drop as fast as your stock." "You thief!" Edward lunged at her. The elevator doors opened. Standing there wasn't an empty car, but two large men in dark suits. They weren't doormen. They were private security. And behind them stood Arthur Penhaligon, Laurel's British right-hand man. Sienna stepped into the elevator, squeezing past the men. She winked at Edward. "Good luck, Edward. You're going to need it." The elevator doors didn't close. Sienna slipped out into the hallway, and Arthur stepped into the penthouse, followed by the two guards. "Mr. Caldwell," Arthur said politely, as if he were announcing dinner. "I'm afraid I have some rather unfortunate news regarding your living arrangements." Edward backed up, breathing hard. "Get out of my house. This is my property." Arthur pulled a document from his jacket pocket. "Technically, yes. The title is in your name," Arthur conceded. "However, you used this property as collateral for a personal line of credit with Vanguard Trust 3 years ago to fund your lifestyle expansion. You missed a margin call an hour ago when your company's stock, which you also leveraged, hit 0. Arthur smiled thinly. "Titanium Holdings acquired Vanguard Trust at noon today. As the new debt holder, we are exercising our right to immediate foreclosure due to insolvency. You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises." "30 minutes?" Edward screamed. "This is illegal. You have to give me 30 days. Eviction laws." "This isn't a residential eviction, Mr. Caldwell," Arthur corrected him. "This is a seizure of assets under a commercial high-risk loan agreement. You signed away your tenant rights for a lower interest rate. Penny-wise, pound foolish." Arthur gestured to the guards. "These gentlemen will supervise your packing. You may take clothing and personal hygiene items. Any electronics, jewelry, art, or furniture are now the property of the bank to offset your substantial debt." Edward looked around the room. The white marble, the view, the life he had built. It was dissolving like sugar in hot water. "Where is she?" Edward whispered. "Is she watching?" "Miss Adams has far more important things to do than watch you pack socks," Arthur said coldly. "She is currently having lunch with the mayor to discuss the expansion of the city's port infrastructure. She is building an empire, Mr. Caldwell. You are merely a footnote she is deleting." Edward slumped onto the nearest sofa, which he realized he no longer owned. He put his head in his hands. "I have nowhere to go," he sobbed. It was a pathetic sound. Arthur checked his pocket watch. "I believe you once suggested Miss Adams stay with her sister in New Jersey?" Arthur mused. "Perhaps you have family who would take you in. Although, given how you spoke about your parents' mediocrity in your autobiography, I suppose that might be an awkward phone call." 29 minutes, Mr. Caldwell," one of the guards said, tossing a black trash bag at Edward's feet. "Start filling." Edward Caldwell, the man who had celebrated his freedom 24 hours ago, fell to his knees. He picked up the trash bag. With shaking hands, he began to shove his wet, ruined clothes into the plastic sack. Every item he touched reminded him of a lie he had told himself. "I am successful. I am powerful. I am untouchable." As he stuffed a soggy dress shirt into the bag, he realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't any of those things. He was just a man who had married a billionaire, treated her like a servant, and was now paying the bill. 3 weeks later, Edward Caldwell sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in a motel room near the Newark airport. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and damp carpet. His bespoke suits were gone, sold to a consignment shop for a fraction of their value to pay for this room and fast food. He was wearing jeans he had bought at a thrift store and a hooded sweatshirt that felt itchy against his skin. He stared at the television mounted in the corner. It was tuned to a financial news network. The headline on the screen read, "The Phoenix Rises. Laurel Adams unveils new vision for global trade." There she was, Laurel. She was standing at a podium, flanked by the mayor of New York and several international dignitaries. She looked radiant. She was wearing a white suit that made her look like a modern-day queen. She spoke with confidence, outlining a billion-dollar initiative to clean up the oceans while expanding shipping routes. The crowd hung on her every word. Edward clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. "That's mine," he muttered to the empty room. "That was supposed to be my legacy." He couldn't accept it. His mind, fractured by the sudden trauma of his fall, had latched onto a delusional hope. "She's doing this to teach me a lesson," he told himself. "She's waiting for me to apologize. She wants me to crawl back so she can forgive me. She still loves me." Penhaligon had erected. He pulled out his Penhaligon had erected. He pulled out his prepaid burner phone and dialed the number of an old contact, a caterer named Jerry, who used to service Caldwell Logistics holiday parties. "Jerry, it's Edward," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "Edward?" Jerry sounded awkward. Look, man, I can't really talk. I heard about everything." "I don't need a job, Jerry," Edward lied. "I'm working on a comeback. Big things. But I need a favor. I know you're catering the Winter Solstice Gala at the Met Museum tonight. Laurel, my ex-wife, is the guest of honor." "Yeah, she is," Jerry said. "It's the event of the season." "I need to get in," Edward said intently. "I have a surprise for her, a reconciliation gift. But security is tight. If you get me in as part of the wait staff, I'll make it worth your while when my new venture launches next month." There was a long silence on the line. Jerry was a nice guy, but he was also gullible. And he remembered Edward as the big-shot CEO who tipped well. "I'm short a bartender for the VIP lounge," Jerry sighed. "If you have a black vest and bow tie, come to the service entrance at 6 p.m. But keep your head down, Edward. I don't want trouble." "No trouble," Edward promised, a manic glint in his eye. "Just a conversation." The Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed into a winter wonderland. Icicle lights draped from the high ceilings, and the air was filled with the sound of a string quartet playing Vivaldi. The city's elite were there, hedge fund managers, politicians, socialites. Edward stood behind the mahogany bar in the VIP section, polishing a glass. He felt invisible. These were people he used to dine with. Now they looked right through him, barking orders for martinis and champagne without making eye contact. It was a humbling, burning kind of torture. Then the room went quiet. Laurel entered. She was breathtaking. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her figure, adorned with sapphires that caught the light. She moved through the crowd with grace, shaking hands, laughing softly. She wasn't the shy, retiring woman he remembered. She was the gravitational center of the room. And she wasn't alone. Walking beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, was a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and salt-and-pepper hair. Edward recognized him immediately. It was Julian Vane, a French shipping magnate Edward had tried, and failed, to do business with for years. Vane was known for being ruthless, brilliant, and impossibly exclusive, and he was looking at Laurel like she was the only woman on earth. Edward felt something snap inside him. The plan to beg for forgiveness evaporated. It was replaced by a surge of pure, toxic jealousy. He slammed the glass down on the bar. He ignored the startled look of the guest waiting for a drink. He unbuttoned his vest, threw it on the floor, and marched out from behind the bar. He pushed through the crowd. Heads turned. Whispers started. Is that Edward Caldwell? "Laurel!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The string quartet stopped playing. The room fell into a deadly silence. Laurel stopped. She turned slowly. Her expression didn't change. She looked at him with the same mild curiosity one might show a disruption on the street. Julian Vane stepped forward protectively, but Laurel placed a hand on his arm to stop him. "Edward," she said calmly. Her voice carried through the silent hall. "I didn't realize you were working tonight." The insult hit him like a physical blow. The crowd rippled with suppressed laughter. "I'm not working!" Edward yelled, stepping closer. 2 security guards started to move toward him, but he held up his hands. "I came to talk to you, to make you see reason." "Reason?" Laurel raised an eyebrow. "Look at all this." Edward gestured wildly at the room. "You stole this from me. You stole my company. You stole my life. You think you can just parade around with him and pretend I never existed?" He pointed a shaking finger at Julian. "I made you, Laurel," Edward screamed, tears of rage pricking his eyes. "Before me you were nobody. You were just a quiet little girl with a trust fund. I gave you a life. I gave you status." Laurel stared at him for a long moment. The silence was agonizing. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it was amplified by the acoustics of the room, ensuring everyone heard. "Edward," she said, pity in her eyes. "You didn't give me a life. You consumed it. You took a woman who loved you, and you whittled her down until she was small enough to fit into the box you built for her. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a mirror to reflect your own ego." She took a step closer to him. The security guards tensed, but she waved them off. "I didn't steal your company," she continued. "I bought it to save the livelihoods of the 600 people you were about to drive into unemployment because you were too arrogant to admit you were failing. And as for status..." She gestured to the room, to the billionaires and leaders watching her with respect. "I didn't need your status, Edward. I have always been who I am. I just stopped hiding it to make you feel comfortable." "You're a liar!" Edward spat. "You played me. You trapped me." "I loved you," Laurel said simply. "That was my only mistake. I loved you enough to play small. But when you divorced me, when you laughed at me in that courtroom, you broke the spell. You didn't unleash a victim, Edward. You unleashed a CEO." She turned to the head of security. "Please remove Mr. Caldwell. He is disturbing the guests." "No, Laurel, wait!" Edward lunged forward, desperation taking over. "I can change. I can be the man you want. Give me another chance. I have nothing." The guards grabbed him, one by each arm. They weren't gentle. As they dragged him backward, his heels skidding on the polished floor, he saw Julian Vane lean in and whisper something to Laurel. Laurel smiled, a genuine, warm smile, and turned her back on Edward. The last thing Edward saw before he was shoved out the heavy doors into the cold New York night was the back of Laurel's blue dress, shimmering like armor. He was thrown onto the sidewalk. The door slammed shut, muffling the music and the warmth. He sat on the concrete, the snow beginning to fall around him. He was alone. Truly, finally alone. The realization settled over him, not with a bang, but with a cold, crushing weight. He wasn't the hero of a tragedy. He was just a man who had held a diamond in his hand, mistook it for glass, and threw it away. 1 year later, the New York winter was merciless. Edward Caldwell pulled his beanie lower, his hands numb inside cheap gloves, as he parked his electric bike outside a luxury high-rise on Park Avenue. He checked the delivery app. Order number 492, penthouse, contactless. He knew this building. In his former life, he had attended parties here, drinking scotch he could no longer afford. Now, the doorman waved him toward the service entrance without a second glance. Edward rode the freight elevator up, the smell of garbage and industrial cleaner, a familiar companion to his new reality. He walked down the plush hallway, his worn sneakers silent on the thick carpet. He set the thermal bags on the mat and raised his phone to take the proof of delivery photo. That's when he heard it. A laugh. Clear, melodic, and hauntingly familiar. The heavy oak door wasn't fully latched. Edward froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He leaned in, peering through the crack. The living room was a world of golden warmth, lit by a roaring fire and a towering Christmas tree. Laurel was sitting on the rug, not in the armor of a CEO, but in a soft cashmere sweater and jeans. She looked relaxed, younger, and utterly at peace, a softness he had never been able to bring out in her. Beside her sat Julian Vane, the shipping magnate. He was building a tower of blocks for a laughing toddler. The scene was a tableau of domestic bliss that Edward had once deemed boring, but now looked like heaven. Julian raised a glass of wine. To the future, Laurel smiled, clinking her glass against his. And to the past, she said softly, for teaching us what not to settle for. Edward felt the breath leave his lungs. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She had simply outgrown him completely. He wasn't a villain in her story anymore. He was a lesson she had learned and forgotten. With shaking hands, Edward snapped the photo of the food bags. Click. He retreated to the service elevator, unable to look back. As the metal doors closed, he caught his reflection in the scratched panel. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked 10 years older than the man who had signed those divorce papers. Back on the street, the snow fell harder. His phone pinged. New order. Burger King. $4.50 payout. Accept, Edward whispered. He pedaled into the freezing traffic, just another anonymous cog in the city. Above him, in the warmth he had thrown away, Laurel didn't look out the window. Edward realized then that his karma wasn't a sudden strike of lightning. It was this, the long, cold, quiet rest of his life, remembering the diamond he had mistaken for glass. And that is the story of Edward Caldwell, a man who learned too late that the most valuable asset in his portfolio wasn't his company, but the woman he underestimated. It's a brutal reminder that when you treat people like they are disposable, you might just find yourself being the one thrown away. Laurel's revenge wasn't about destroying him. It was about outgrowing him, which is the most powerful revenge of all. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Share this video with a friend who needs a reminder that Success is the best revenge. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.